Hello class, this is Professor Boyer, and in this lecture we will be covering Aristotle's investigation of the definition of virtue in the second book of his masterwork, the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle begins his search for the definition of virtue by giving an overview of what virtue is. This is similar to how he gave an overview of what happiness is before he attained the definition. So you might remember that in Book 1, Aristotle defined happiness as rational activity in accordance with excellence or virtue in a complete life. In this definition, he presumes that we know what rational activity means. It means activity guided by reason. And he also assumes that we know what in a complete life is, that it's activities that we perform over the course of our entire life and not just once. However, Aristotle does not define happiness as merely acting rationally, because we can act rationally, we can use our reason to do bad things. A bank robber who plans out his bank robbery very carefully may be acting rationally, as far as he has thought through every step, but he's not acting virtuously, nor is he a good person. Therefore, Aristotle added to his definition of happiness that happiness consists in acting in accordance with excellence of virtue. However, in order to understand happiness, we need to know what excellence and virtue are, and that is what he will be doing in Book 2. So first, in Chapter 1, Aristotle gives an overview of what virtue is and what it isn't. So he first says that virtue or excellence is something natural. It's proper for us. It's compatible with our nature. It's something which is fulfilling of us, insofar as it's part of what makes us happy. But calling it natural needs to be distinguished with another sense of natural, namely something you were born with. Like Plato, Aristotle does not think that we are born virtuous. He recognizes that people must develop virtue over the course of their lives. If someone was born virtuous, there would be no need to learn ethics because they would be naturally able to do the right thing all the time and would be good people just in virtue of their genetics or in virtue of their heredity. So virtue, unlike natural powers with which you are born, virtue is developed by action. You are born with the natural power of sight, and you don't have to see in order to gain the power of sight. Virtue, on the other hand, comes after practicing virtuous activity, so virtue is something that we must acquire during our life. And then Aristotle notes that characteristics develop from corresponding activities, and thus it is with virtue. So the only way to become virtuous is to perform activities associated with virtue, and to cease to be virtuous or to develop vice, the opposite of virtue. That will happen if we are performing actions that are vicious. So Aristotle's basic observations are first that virtue is not natural to us, but is acquired, and secondly that it's acquired by performing actions associated with virtue. In Chapter 2 then, Aristotle proceeds to talk about the method in the practical sciences. That is, he's giving us an idea of how he's going to be searching for the definition and what the goal is in searching for the idea of virtue. So the first point is that ethics is a practical science. Practical sciences differ from theoretical sciences, such as physics, biology, metaphysics, etc., because they don't aim at theoretical knowledge. They don't aim at knowledge of truth for its own sake, but they aim at knowledge that we can use in action. So we seek knowledge of goodness and virtue in order that we may use that knowledge to guide our actions and become good. He then tells us a basic principle of ethics, that we must act according to right reason. Now, he is deriving this from his definition of happiness as the ultimate end in Book 1. There, as we just mentioned, Aristotle tells us that we can only reach our ultimate fulfillment by acting rationally in accord with virtue, and that happiness as our ultimate end will be the good and the goal that directs all of our other choices. So, we must act according to reason, but not just reason, but according to right reason. So, in order to know what is right, what is good, we must know what virtue is, so that we may know the principle that should guide our reasoning. The last point that he gives is that ethics can only give a general account of how we should act. That is, we should not expect a study of ethics to tell us answers about how to act in every single situation. Rather, ethics will give us general principles that can guide our actions, but we need to develop the ability to recognize when the principles apply and how they apply to different circumstances and situations in our lives. Now, with these preliminaries out of the way, let's turn to the actual search for what virtue is. Aristotle knows that virtue, since it's not natural and is something acquired, can be understood if we understand how it's acquired. By looking at how it's acquired and the things associated with virtue, we'll be able to determine what sort of thing virtue is. So first he considers how it is acquired. So he tells us that the nature of moral qualities is such that they are destroyed by defect and by excess, and that they are preserved by the mean. Now Aristotle gives us this truth and gives it by giving some examples. He says that in the case of physical exercise, too little exercise will destroy our health and our strength. Likewise, too much exercise also destroys us. That is, you shouldn't exercise too much or too little. Likewise, eating too little food and drink will destroy your health, and eating too much food and drink will destroy your health. So if you eat too little, you won't have enough nutrition. If you eat too much, you'll get fat. Thus, to preserve these qualities, we must do the right amount. And this is why, as you said earlier, we must be guided by right reason. We need to find what the right way to act is in order to preserve these qualities. So just as excess and defect destroy these natural qualities of strength and health, so too with moral qualities. He tells us that the same applies to self-control, courage, and the other virtues. The man who shuns and fears everything and never stands his ground becomes a coward, whereas a man who knows no fear at all and goes to meet every danger becomes reckless. Therefore, courage is destroyed by excess and by deficiency, but is preserved by the mean. Aristotle then notes that virtue, since it is the result of acting virtuously, and vice is the result of acting viciously, virtue will be destroyed by vice and by acting viciously. He then notes that the actions which produce virtue and vice will be performed as a result of virtue and vice. That is, if you're virtuous, your virtue will allow you and cause you to do good actions. A good person, in virtue of his goodness, will be able to more easily do what is right. And a bad person, in virtue of being vicious, will tend to do what is wrong. These actions, however, will reinforce these dispositions. Virtuous behavior makes us more inclined towards the good. So virtuous behavior reinforces virtue, and a reinforced virtue produces more virtuous action, which reinforces virtue. So it's a feedback loop. This is why it's important to acquire virtue, because if we do not seek to acquire virtue, we will end up spiraling down in a cycle of vice. Aristotle then, in chapter 3, considers some properties that allow us to determine what virtue is and what vice is, and who is virtuous and who is vicious. And his test is pain and pleasure. Pain and pleasure. So he gives us 4 points. He says that what someone takes pleasure in and what they find painful will indicate whether they're virtuous or vicious. So if you take pleasure in good things, if you enjoy good things and find bad things and bad actions painful, if you tell a lie and you feel torn up inside, that's an indication that you find lying painful. And if lying is bad, that's a sign that you are not disposed to lie. However, if you tell a lie and you find it pleasant, in fact you enjoy lying, that tells us something about who you are and about your character. So, with this in mind, the idea that what is pleasant, or what you find pleasant, tells us something about you, and what you find painful tells us something about you. Aristotle then moves on to these points. So first, pleasure and pain are a good test of virtue in this way, because desire for pleasure can motivate bad actions, and fear of pain can hinder good actions. So we can be drawn to bad actions. Why would anyone do anything bad? Because we find it pleasant. And why would we not do good things? Because we find it painful. Next, virtue concerns actions and emotions. Because pleasure and pain are effects of actions and emotions. That is, if we have a certain emotion, we will experience pain because of it. So if you are sad, that emotion will be painful. If you are happy, that will lead to pleasure. Likewise, actions produce pleasure and pain. Next, he notes that we use pain as a punishment to dissuade people from bad actions, showing that pain is a motivator. Yes, pain is a motivator that we associate with activities and with voluntary choices. We punish people because we believe that they are responsible and that they will not choose to do bad actions if those actions are painful. So if someone is inclined to do evil, if someone is inclined to lie, for example, and they are punished, that punishment will dissuade them from lying because they will associate lying with being punished and thus not do it. Aristotle's last point is that every characteristic of the soul shows its true nature in its relation to and is concerned with those factors that make it better or worse. So to summarize this initial investigation then, we can say that 1. Virtue or excellence is concerned with pleasures and pains. Pleasure and pain are motivating factors for virtuous or vicious actions. They also are the result of virtuous and vicious actions. They can also be used as motivations or means of dissuading people. You reward a child for doing his chores with ice cream, and you punish a child for talking back by taking away his TV time. I may or may not be referring to a toddler in my own house. Second, actions that produce virtue develop virtue, and actions that don't produce virtue destroy it. So doing good deeds makes you good. Doing bad deeds makes you bad. And as we saw earlier, becoming good will help you do good more readily and more easily, and doing bad will prevent you from doing good readily and easily and will incline you towards evil. Last, Aristotle notes that virtue is most fully actualized in actions that produce it. So, if you are a good person, you've developed good habits, but you really don't do any moral activities, then you're not really fully virtuous. The fully virtuous man is someone who is performing virtuous actions. This is to say that you're not fully virtuous when you're asleep. You may be a good person, but you're not as good when you're asleep as when you're actually doing good deeds. Therefore, the idea of being a good person or a virtuous person, good and virtue here I think for Aristotle are synonymous. To being a good person or virtuous person is our goal in life and is most fulfilling, and we are most happy then when we are doing and living a good life. Merely having done good things in the past is not enough to be happy. We must continue to do them. So with this summary of our initial investigation of virtue, that is chapters 1 through 3, Aristotle then brings up an objection to his position. The idea of what it is to be a good person. Now one might think, in chapter 4 Aristotle mentions this, one might think that look, I'm a good person if I do the right thing. It's not a matter of having a particular character or a particular outlook. All that you need to be good is to do the right thing. Even if you don't want to do it, even if you don't take pleasure in doing it, as long as you do the right thing, you're a good person. In fact, you might even be a better person if you don't feel like doing the right thing, but you do it anyway. To quote Aristotle, he sums up this objection or this outlook. If people perform just actions and exercise self-control, they are already just and self-controlled, in the same way that they are literate and musical. They write correctly and practice music. And this, I think, is a common notion that we have, that as long as you have the right sentiments, or are turned off or repulsed by evil things, then you're good. Or if you just do something that is good, even if it's not coming from a wellspring or a love of goodness, as long as you just do your duty. This is what we mentioned before, this idea of Kantian duty, the deontological position that we talked about in our lecture on realism and non-realism in ethics. On the deontological point of view, you are good if you do just actions, not because it springs from a deep-seated characteristic or a love of virtue, an emotional disposition to virtue, but you're good just if you do good deeds. And doing good deeds is enough to be good. Now, there's a certain truth to this. Aristotle doesn't think that that's enough. And he gives several reasons why. First, someone can do something unintentionally. So you can do a good action without intending to do it. Now, just because you do something that's good doesn't necessarily make you a good person, because if you do a good deed unintentionally or by accident, and then the next moment you voluntarily and intentionally do something bad, we wouldn't really say that your good deed counted for much. If I, for example, am holding the door open, but I'm not holding it to help a pregnant lady who's walking through the door, I just happen to pause because I get caught up in my own thoughts. Would you say that I did a good deed? I might be thanked for holding the door open, but am I really a good person for doing this? Well, I didn't do it intentionally. I didn't choose to do it voluntarily. Wouldn't we say that the real test of my goodness is if, in the same situation, if I saw the pregnant woman coming, if I held the door open, knowing she needed help and assistance, or if I let the door slam close in her face? In that situation, we see that voluntariness and intention is a key part of judging goodness or badness. What you do on purpose indicates your character, indicates your personal goodness. Therefore, since someone might accidentally do something good, but that doesn't necessarily make him a good person, Aristotle gives us the following characteristics of how an action is done in a virtuous way. What are the characteristics that define a truly good action, that indicate a truly good person? He says, they must be performed in the way that people who are actually good act. That is, these actions must be intentional. So first, the moral agent must know what he is doing. You must be aware of your action. And you must be aware that it's virtuous. Second, you must choose to perform it. It cannot be done unintentionally. And moreover, you must be choosing it because it is virtuous. Think of a politician who's running for office. He knows that if he gives money to a homeless person on the street, he may get good publicity. Let's say there's a reporter nearby who sees him and will take a picture. He gives the money to the homeless person because he knows it's a good thing to do. He chooses to do this good action. But if he's giving the money to the homeless person just because he thinks it will help him get a bump in the polls, not because he's doing it because it's the right thing, just because it will give him an appearance of virtue. Would we really say that he's a good person, that he's motivated by goodwill? Or would we say that he's just using this person for his own benefit? That if no one was around to see him, he wouldn't pay any mind to someone in need. The distinction between those two actions, the person who does a good action and chooses to do a good action because he thinks he can benefit in some material way, but wouldn't do that action if he doesn't benefit, and a person who knows a good action, chooses to do the action because it's the right thing to do, because it's a good thing to do, is the distinction between a virtuous action done virtuously and a virtuous action that's either done unintentionally or for a bad reason. The first case, where it's done intentionally, we wouldn't really say it's a moral action. It doesn't count for anything. And when it's done for a bad or selfish motivation, I don't think we would call it good. It might be a good action in the abstract, but in practice, it's not being done properly. And his intention there is not building a habit of virtue. This is why Aristotle adds this last qualification, that the action and the choice to perform the action must spring from, that is, they must result from a firm and unchangeable character. We can only call someone a good person or virtuous if they have a firm and unchangeable character, which is the reason for this. It's not that you have an emotional disposition where you see the homeless man and you feel sorry for him and you give him money, but then you see another homeless man the next day and you feel repulsed by him and so you kick him. The disposition which leads you to do the good action in the one case must be something constant in you. And you must act in a consistent way, because as Aristotle noted in that definition of happiness from Book 1, happiness is rational activity in accord with the excellence of virtue in a complete life. And you cannot act virtuously over the course of your whole life unless the character you have, which motivates and leads you to do the right thing, is firm and unchanging, rather than vacillating and soft. So, having explained then that virtue is necessary to be good, it's not enough just to do the right thing. We have to do the right thing intentionally, voluntarily, knowing that it's the right thing, and because it's the right thing, not merely because we get something else out of it. With these points in mind, let us turn to the definition of virtue. Now, you may recall this from your previous philosophy classes, but a good definition has two component parts. The definition must identify what we call the genus and the difference of the thing defined. So the genus is the general class or kind which a thing belongs to. In the case of a human being, if the definition of human being is rational animal, the definition of human being contains the genus animal. That's the general kind of thing a human being is, an animal. However, there are many different types of animals. So merely calling a human being an animal does not tell us fully what it is. It tells us partly what a human being is. But insofar as they're different animals, we need something more. We need to know what makes human beings a unique kind of animal. What distinguishes human beings from all other animals. And that is what we call specific difference, the difference that makes human beings a unique species. All definitions must be universal and yet unique. They must be common insofar as they must belong to all individual cases. Therefore, they must extend to all instances of a kind. And they must be universal insofar as they tell us what kind of thing a thing is, while also telling us what makes that thing unique within that kind. So the first part, the general class or general kind of thing, which the thing defined is called the genus. The difference is what distinguishes it from other members of that class. Aristotle then turns to what virtue's genus is. He says virtue is one of the following three kinds of things. There are three possibilities. It's a kind of emotion, it's a kind of power or capacity, or it's a kind of characteristic or habit. He then goes through and examines each one of these, looking at the first two. He first says virtue is not an emotion. Now, how do we know virtue is not an emotion? Aristotle turns back to and considers those principles that we got from our initial investigation of virtue. In that initial investigation of virtue in chapters 1 through 3, we determined that we are called good or bad based on our virtue. However, we are not called good or bad based on our emotions. We're not called good or bad based on our emotions. That is, we're not praised or blamed based on our emotions, because merely having an emotion isn't intrinsically good or bad. It all depends on what we are experiencing the emotion with regards to. If I feel happiness at another's success, we would say that that is a praiseworthy emotion. If I feel happiness at another's failure, or Schadenfreude, to use the German term, we would say that that's not a good emotion. So our emotions, just by being emotions in themselves, are not what we are praised or blamed for. It's the additional thing, this additional determination that orients our emotions, that is the cause of us feeling emotions at particular circumstances or situations. If you're blamed for being happy when someone else falls on his face, we say that the blameworthy part of you isn't that you felt happy, but it's what made you feel happy when you saw this sort of circumstance, when you saw someone fall on his face. Likewise, if you feel happiness when you see somebody succeed, when you see someone achieve some great thing in their life, rather than feeling envious, you feel happy for them, we would say that what is good about you is not your happiness, but what made you feel happy when you observed this, because it's not necessarily that you feel happy. Many people, if they saw, for example, a friend get engaged, they might feel bitter or jealous that it's not them. Aristotle gives this example of being angry. So being angry is not right or wrong. It all depends on what you're angry about. Aristotle then concludes that virtue also is not a power, because we're not called good or bad based off our abilities. We're praised or blamed based off how we use our abilities. And as we noted before, not just how we use our abilities once, but how we use our abilities consistently. Since then, virtue is not a kind of emotion. It's not a power or capacity. He concludes it must be a characteristic or habit. From this, Aristotle then turns to the difference, that is, what makes virtue unique. Now, if virtue is a characteristic, we must note that vice is a characteristic at all, since vice and virtue are opposites. If you don't have vice, you have virtue, and if you don't have virtue, you have vice. So therefore, we need to know, if virtue and vice are both characteristics, what makes a characteristic virtuous as opposed to vicious? Now, with this in mind, we need to bring back up some of those conclusions from our initial investigation of virtue in chapters 1 through 3. First, virtue renders good the thing itself, of which it is the excellence. Virtue makes something good. And secondly, virtue causes the thing of which it is the excellence to perform its function well. You may recall from book 1, the function is the proper activity of a thing. With this in mind, Aristotle now begins to figure out what the difference between virtue and vice is. They are both characteristics, but virtue is the characteristic that makes someone good. Vice is the characteristic that makes someone bad. Aristotle then, in order to understand virtue, turns to look at experts. He says, experts are people who have a certain excellence. Now, they might not have what we would call a moral virtue, right? An expert in, for example, sword fighting does not have a moral virtue, but he does have a certain virtue. He has a virtue or excellence at being good at fighting with a sword, say a fencer. I took fencing lessons many years ago, and I wasn't very good at it. I didn't have any excellence. I wasn't a virtuoso at sword fighting or fencing. My instructor, however, was. So I can look at what my instructor did and see what made him so good at fencing. Aristotle says that every expert who possesses excellence or perfection possesses it because they avoid excess and deficiency and aim at the mean. So the idea is that they do not do too much of something or too little of something, but they do just the right amount in every single case. In fencing, you don't lunge too much or too little. You don't overextend your arm or underextend the arm. You extend the right amount. Likewise, you don't move your wrist too much when blocking a sword or too little. In both cases, you open yourself up to being hit. Now, Aristotle wants to be clear, though, what the mean is in the case of virtue. The mean can mean two things. There's an absolute mean, where it's the same for all cases. So the mean between 2 and 10 is 6. No matter what the thing is that we're considering, if there's 2 and there's 10, the mean will be 6. Think about the average there, right? So we add 2 and 10 together, divide by 2, since there's 2 cases here, the answer is 6. However, with the case of virtue, virtue is not a mean that's the same for all individuals. Now, you must perform the right amount and not do too much or too little of something. But what the right amount is will depend on who you are in the case of virtue. So take, for example, Houston Texans star J.J. Watt, I have been told, eats 10,000 calories a day, or 10,000 calories a day. He needs this because he's a really big guy who burns a lot of energy while practicing to play football. That's the right amount for him to eat. If he ate 5,000 calories, he wouldn't have enough energy. If he ate 20,000 calories, he would have too much food and he would get fat. He would be slow. So J.J. Watt needs to eat 10,000 calories a day because relative to his body type and his profession, that's the right amount. I, on the other hand, am a philosophy professor. I am not expending that much energy on physical activity. I mostly sit around, read books, write papers, prepare lectures, and then go to class, where the most I do is walk around. This is not heavy physical labor, rather it's mental labor. I don't need 10,000 calories a day. For me, I think probably the average of 2,000 calories is about right. If I ate only 1,000 calories, I wouldn't have enough energy. If I ate more than 2,000 calories, I'm probably going to have too much food stored in me, and I'm going to get fat. So the right amount, we see, varies depending on the circumstances that an individual finds himself in. Now, this doesn't mean, however, that Aristotle is a relativist in the sense of moral relativism, as we said before. Aristotle's not saying that everything's relative to an individual, including relative to an individual's opinions. He's rather saying that there is an objective good. You need to eat a correct amount. If I think that 10,000 calories is the good amount for me to eat, I'll be wrong. Things do vary depending on the individual. Now, there are some exceptions. There's certain things that are always wrong, but we'll get to that in a second. So the first thing that we want to take away is virtue is a characteristic that makes someone good, and goodness is maintained by doing the right amount, not by doing too much or too little. So virtue, because it makes you good, virtue will consist in a characteristic that aims at and tends to produce actions that are just right, that aren't too much or too little. You can call it the Goldilocks principle, so to speak. So then, excess and deficiency destroy excellence. Aristotle concludes, therefore virtue aims at the mean, which is what makes it different from vice. Vice is a characteristic that tends towards extremes. If you're vicious, you might tend towards, with regards to food, you might tend towards eating too much or too little. Moreover, though, he wants to make sure that we recognize the other aspects of virtue we got from our initial investigation. Since a truly virtuous person performs actions intentionally, and that's what makes him differ from someone who performs actions unintentionally, Aristotle adds these following qualifications. First, virtue involves choice. Second, virtue tends towards actions which are determined by reason. And third, these actions that fall from virtue and that therefore produce virtue are actions that are determined by reason as used by man of practical wisdom. Merely thinking something through logically is not enough to say that this is rational for Aristotle. He says, as we recall from before, that it must be according to right reason. And right reason is what is used by man who is wise in regards to practical matters or practical wisdom. Thus, with these four aspects, virtue aims at the mean, it involves choice, it's determined by reason, and the reasoning is as done by man of practical wisdom, Aristotle arrives at his definition of virtue. This, as with all definitions by philosophers, is important and we need to take note of it. So in your book you should probably highlight this, write this down. Virtue or excellence is a characteristic involving choice, as opposed to a characteristic which is unintentional, a disposition which you might just have naturally or inborn, as if you naturally tend to like chocolate, as opposed to vanilla ice cream. So virtue or excellence is a characteristic involving choice, and it consists in observing the mean relative to us. What kind of mean relative to us? A mean relative to us which is defined and determined by a rational principle. That is, we need to use reason to recognize what the right amount, what's just right for each of us. Moreover, our use of reason here is not just thinking logically, but it's using truth, using wisdom. So it's defining what's just right for us in the way someone who's wise in regard to practical matters, so using the same principles a man of practical wisdom would use to determine it. And we call it a mean by referring it to two vices, to two bad characteristics, a characteristic that tends towards excess and a characteristic that tends towards defect. In the case of courage, as we said, the excess would be rashness, foolhardiness. The defect would be cowardice. Therefore, in respect of its essence and definition of its essential nature, virtue is a mean. However, and this is important, Aristotle then adds, in regard to goodness and excellence, it is an extreme. So when he says, in regards to goodness and excellence, it is an extreme, Aristotle is making clear that virtue is not some relativistic state. It is objectively, absolutely, and completely good. And vice is objectively, absolutely, and completely bad. It's not that we have vice on one side, doing too much. Virtue in the middle. Vice on the other side, doing too little. And because virtue's in the middle, it's the right mix of good and bad. No, virtue is completely good, and vice is completely bad. Vice is bad because it is not directed towards happiness, and virtue is completely good because it is directly ordered towards happiness. Now, our last point, which I mentioned before, is that Aristotle is not a relativist. He's not a moral relativist when he says a mean relative to us. Because his point there is that there are actions that are good, but we all must recognize what is the right way to perform those good actions given our particular circumstances. However, not all actions admit of virtue. Some actions can never be performed virtuously. That is, there's no mean. As we said in the previous slide, virtue is an extreme with regard to goodness, and vice is an extreme with regard to badness. Therefore, if certain actions are essentially vicious, there's never a way to perform them that's right. There's no moderating influence. Aristotle gives us an example, and I love the way he puts this. In cases of this sort, in cases of absolute vice, intrinsically bad things, let's say adultery, rightness and wrongness do not depend on the way that we do it. They don't depend on committing it with the right woman at the right time in the right manner, but the mere fact of committing such an action at all is to do wrong. So if my wife asked me if I committed adultery on her, I said, yes, but it's okay, honey. I did it with your sister on Tuesday with the lights out. You think she would say, well, okay, well, as long as you did it with my sister on Tuesday with the lights out, that's okay? Of course not. The fact that I committed an act of adultery is bad no matter how I did it, with whom I did it, or when I did it. Aristotle's point here is then that our rational principle will recognize that there are certain actions that are not conductive to virtue because they are incompatible with human nature and human flourishing, and such actions can never be done well. Therefore, since virtue in terms of goodness is an extreme, there's no right way to be bad. Every way of performing bad actions is bad and wrong. All badness and vice is to be shunned. Alright, well, thank you for watching this lecture. There'll be one more lecture on virtue, in which we'll just consider a few further implications of this definition, examples of the mean in various virtues, and the relationship between the mean and the extremes. This will conclude Book 2. Thank you for listening.